Right now, if you drank directly from a random puddle, a stagnant pond, or an unfiltered river, you'd be taking a serious health risk, potentially exposing yourself to a wide range of dangerous bacteria, parasites, and other pathogens. Yet you've probably watched countless nature documentaries showing wild animals casually drinking from exactly this kind of visibly murky, clearly questionable water source, seemingly without any consequence whatsoever. So what's actually going on here? Are animals somehow immune to the dangers of dirty water that would make a human seriously ill, or is something else entirely happening that documentary footage simply doesn't show you? Let's dig into this properly, because the honest answer involves some real fascinating biology alongside an important correction to a fairly common misconception. Let's start with the most important point worth establishing directly and clearly up front because it corrects a truly widespread misunderstanding. Animals aren't actually immune to the dangers of contaminated water. Wild animals absolutely do get sick, and in some cases die from drinking contaminated water, just as humans can. This isn't some kind of special biological immunity unique to wild animals that humans simply lack. The reality is considerably more nuanced, involving a combination of genuine physiological differences, different levels of accumulated exposure, and resulting immune adaptation, and, importantly, a significant amount of selective observation bias in what documentary footage and casual wildlife viewing actually tends to show and emphasize. Let's talk about that selective observation bias first, because it represents a surprisingly significant part of the overall explanation worth addressing directly. Nature documentaries and casual wildlife observation overwhelmingly show healthy, currently functioning animals going about their normal daily activities, including drinking from various water sources. Animals that become seriously ill or die from contaminated water exposure typically do so somewhat later, away from the specific water source itself, and are considerably less likely to be filmed or casually observed during that specific illness and decline, particularly since sick or dying animals often instinctively withdraw to hidden, sheltered locations rather than remaining visible in the open. This creates a meaningful, systematic bias in what people actually get to see and remember regarding animals and water consumption, overwhelmingly featuring the animals that didn't get seriously sick, while the animals that did become ill or died from contaminated water exposure remain largely invisible within the broader pattern of casual wildlife observation and documentary footage. This detail alone accounts for a meaningful portion of the apparent discrepancy worth addressing directly. It's not that animals never get sick from dirty water, it's that the specific moments when this happens are considerably less likely to end up in the footage or casual observations most people actually encounter and remember, creating a skewed, incomplete impression that underrepresents the very real risks wild animals seriously do face from contaminated water sources. Let's talk about genuine physiological differences that do exist between different animal species and humans specifically, because this represents an important, real part of the explanation worth exploring in detail beyond simply the observation bias already discussed. Different animal species have evolved varying levels of digestive and immune system resilience to specific pathogens commonly found in their particular natural environment, shaped by generations of ongoing evolutionary exposure and adaptation to the specific microorganisms present within their typical habitat and water sources. An animal that has evolved within a specific ecosystem over countless generations, repeatedly exposed to the same general range of local waterborne pathogens throughout that evolutionary history, may have developed meaningfully more robust immune responses and digestive resilience specifically tailored to those particular local pathogens, compared to a human traveler encountering the exact same water source for the very first time with no comparable evolutionary or personal immune exposure history to draw on. This detail connects to a broader biological principle worth understanding directly. Immune resilience to specific pathogens isn't a fixed universal trait applying identically across an entire species regardless of environment. It's frequently shaped significantly by a population's specific accumulated exposure history to the particular pathogens present within their own local environment, which explains why a local wild animal might tolerate a specific contaminated water source relatively well, while a human or even a different animal species without that same specific local evolutionary exposure history might become considerably more seriously ill from exposure to that exact same water source and its particular pathogen profile. Let's talk about stomach acid and its role in this broader picture too, because this represents an important, specific physiological factor worth exploring in more detail. Many animal species, particularly certain scavengers and predators that regularly consume carrion or otherwise risky food sources as a normal part of their typical diet, have evolved notably more acidic stomach environments compared to humans, providing considerably enhanced protection against a wide range of dangerous bacteria that would otherwise survive digestion and cause serious illness. Vultures represent a particularly striking striking, frequently cited example, possessing stomach acid concentrated enough to effectively neutralize many of the dangerous bacteria commonly found in decomposing carrion, a specific evolutionary adaptation directly tied to their particular ecological role and typical diet. While this particular example relates more directly to food consumption than water specifically, it illustrates the broader underlying principle clearly. Different species have evolved meaningfully, different levels of physiological defense against specific pathogens, shaped directly by the particular ecological niche and typical diet or water sources that species has occupied and relied upon throughout its own evolutionary history. Let's talk about the specific pathogens actually present in typical wild water sources too, because this represents an important, often overlooked detail worth clarifying directly. Not every visibly murky or unclear-looking water source is necessarily dangerously contaminated in the specific way that would cause serious illness. Water can appear murky or discolored due to completely harmless suspended sediment, minerals, or naturally occurring tannins from decomposing plant matter, none of which necessarily indicates the actual presence of dangerous pathogens capable of causing serious illness. Visual appearance alone, whether water looks clean or looks murky, isn't actually a fully reliable indicator of genuine biological safety, which means some of the seemingly dirty-looking water wild animals casually drink from in documentary footage may actually carry considerably less genuine pathogenic risk than its murky visual appearance alone might otherwise suggest to a casual human observer unfamiliar with this important distinction. Let's talk about the specific animals that do get sick and die from contaminated water too, because this represents important, direct evidence worth including to properly balance out the earlier discussion regarding physiological resilience and observation bias. Wildlife researchers and conservation biologists have documented numerous cases of wild animal populations experiencing serious illness and significant mortality directly linked to contaminated water sources, particularly in situations involving unusual or severe environmental contamination, algal blooms producing dangerous toxins, industrial pollution, or the introduction of new pathogens into a water source that the local animal population hadn't previously encountered and therefore hadn't developed any specific evolutionary resilience to. These documented cases provide direct, compelling evidence that wild animals absolutely remain vulnerable to remarkably dangerous water contamination, particularly when that specific contamination falls outside the range of pathogens and conditions their particular evolutionary history had previously prepared them to handle relatively well. Let's talk about young, elderly, and already weakened or immunocompromised animals specifically too, because this represents an important, frequently overlooked detail relevant to properly understanding this broader topic. Even within a given species generally possessing decent resilience to local water sources overall, young animals with still developing immune systems, elderly animals with declining physiological function, and animals already weakened by injury, malnutrition, or existing illness remain considerably more vulnerable to waterborne illness compared to a healthy adult member of that same species. This detail helps explain why documentary footage, which tends to disproportionately showcase healthy, currently thriving adult animals going about their typical daily activities, may create a somewhat misleading overall impression regarding the true, full range of vulnerability actually present across an entire wild animal population, including its more vulnerable young, elderly, and already weakened members specifically. Let's talk about a particularly well-documented category of wild animal water-related mortality worth exploring specifically: mass die-offs linked to harmful algal blooms. Various documented cases involving waterfowl, fish, and other wildlife populations show significant, sometimes catastrophic mortality events directly linked to toxic algal blooms, which produce seriously dangerous toxins that most wild animal species have no meaningful evolved resistance to, given that these specific toxic bloom events, while a naturally occurring phenomenon, don't happen with anywhere near the frequency or predictability needed for a local animal population to develop reliable evolutionary resistance the way they might against more consistently, predictably present pathogens. These well-documented mass mortality events provide some of the clearest, most dramatic evidence directly contradicting any assumption that wild animals possess some kind of general all-purpose immunity to water-related health threats. Let's talk about gut microbiome differences between species too, because this represents an increasingly well-studied, seriously important dimension of this broader topic worth exploring in more depth. Research on animal gut microbiomes has found that different species host meaningfully different communities of beneficial bacteria within their digestive systems, and these differing microbiome compositions can significantly affect how well a given species tolerates and processes various pathogens encountered through food or water. Some research suggests certain wild animal species have evolved gut microbiome compositions specifically well suited to helping process and neutralize particular pathogens commonly found within their typical natural environment, functioning as an additional, biologically sophisticated layer of protection beyond simple stomach acid concentration alone. This represents a truly active, ongoing area of scientific research, with researchers continuing to investigate exactly how significant a role gut microbiome variation actually plays in explaining differing pathogen resilience across different animal species, including humans specifically. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about amphibians and fish specifically too, because they offer an interesting, somewhat different comparative angle worth exploring directly, given how their entire life cycle involves considerably more direct, sustained exposure to their aquatic environment compared to land-dwelling animals that merely visit water sources periodically to drink. Fish and amphibians have evolved under sustained, constant selective pressure from whatever pathogens are typically present within their specific aquatic habitat, arguably representing an even more extreme, thoroughly adapted case of the same basic evolutionary principle already discussed regarding land animals and their local water sources. However, fish and amphibian populations also demonstrably experience significant illness and mass mortality, events linked to water contamination, particularly pollution-related contamination falling outside their typical evolutionary experience, further reinforcing the broader point already established throughout this discussion. Even animals with the most extensive, sustained evolutionary exposure to their specific aquatic environment remain vulnerable when contamination shifts meaningfully outside the specific range of conditions and pathogens their evolutionary history actually prepared them to handle. Let's talk about specific research involving controlled comparative studies too, because this represents valuable, more rigorously controlled evidence worth mentioning specifically beyond the observational and anecdotal evidence already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Researchers have conducted controlled studies deliberately exposing different animal species to identical, carefully measured doses of specific pathogens under monitored laboratory conditions, allowing for direct, controlled comparison of how different species actually respond physiologically to the exact same pathogen exposure. These controlled studies generally confirm the broader pattern already established through observational evidence. Meaningful variation in pathogen resistance exists across different species, but this resistance is never absolute or complete, and sufficiently high pathogen concentrations or sufficiently unfamiliar pathogens can still cause serious illness even in species that generally demonstrate above-average resilience to more typical, commonly encountered local contamination levels. Let's talk about migratory animals specifically too, because they present a particularly interesting, complicating wrinkle worth exploring directly within this broader topic. Animals that migrate across large distances, encountering many different water sources with different specific pathogen profiles along their migratory route, don't have the same opportunity to develop the kind of highly specific, localized evolutionary adaptation already discussed regarding animals that remain within a single, consistent local environment throughout their entire life. This means migratory species frequently rely more heavily on general, broadly applicable physiological resilience mechanisms, robust general immune function, efficient kidney filtration, rather than the kind of narrowly specific, highly localized pathogen adaptation that non-migratory local wildlife populations can more readily develop and maintain over successive generations, remaining within the same consistent environment. Let's talk about how this entire topic connects to broader questions about human evolutionary history too, because it's worth exploring one final, truly interesting angle before wrapping up completely. Some researchers studying human evolutionary history propose that early humans, before the development of water treatment technology and modern sanitation infrastructure, likely possessed somewhat greater natural resilience to locally common common waterborne pathogens compared to many people living in modern developed societies today, precisely because those early humans maintained the kind of sustained, regular exposure to natural water sources that modern developed world humans generally no longer experience. This suggests modern humans may have, in a certain limited sense, actually lost some degree of natural pathogen resilience that earlier human populations likely possessed, not because of any negative change in human biology itself, but simply because modern water treatment infrastructure has removed the kind of regular, ongoing pathogen exposure that would otherwise help maintain that specific resilience across successive generations. Let's talk about how researchers actually study and confirm the specific relationship between wild animal water consumption and illness too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Wildlife biologists and veterinary researchers studying this specific topic rely on a combination of methods, including direct observation of wild animal populations over extended periods, examination of animal remains for signs of illness linked to specific pathogens, and controlled laboratory studies examining exactly how different animal species' digestive and immune systems actually respond to specific pathogens under carefully monitored conditions. This combination of research methods has allowed researchers to build a considerably more complete, nuanced picture of animal water-related illness and resilience than casual documentary footage or wildlife observation alone could ever reliably provide on its own. Let's talk about human-specific vulnerability to contaminated water too, because understanding why humans specifically tend to be more vulnerable helps complete this broader comparative picture. Modern humans, particularly those living in developed regions with reliable, thoroughly treated water infrastructure, generally have had considerably less regular exposure to the specific pathogens commonly found in untreated natural water sources compared to wild animals living continuously within that same natural environment, meaning modern humans frequently lack the kind of ongoing immune exposure and adaptation that helps local wild animal populations manage the specific local pathogen profile more effectively. This detail connects to a broader, well-documented pattern in human health more generally. Populations with limited or inconsistent prior exposure to a specific pathogen frequently experience more severe illness upon eventual exposure, compared to populations with more regular, ongoing exposure and the resulting immune adaptation that typically develops from that consistent exposure over time. Let's talk briefly about domesticated animals, particularly dogs too, because this offers a truly relatable, practically relevant example worth including before wrapping up this discussion. Many pet owners have noticed their dogs seemingly tolerating puddle water, pond water, or other questionable outdoor water sources without any apparent issue, which often reinforces exactly the same general misconception already discussed at length throughout this topic. Veterinarians generally confirm that dogs, much like their wild canine relatives, do show a degree of tolerance to certain common environmental bacteria, but veterinary records also clearly show that dogs regularly do become ill from contaminated water exposure, including serious conditions linked to specific bacteria and parasites commonly found in stagnant or contaminated outdoor water sources. This detail reinforces the broader pattern already established throughout this entire topic in a directly relatable, easily observable context. Partial tolerance and complete immunity represent two very different things, and even animals showing reasonably good tolerance towards certain common environmental pathogens remain seriously vulnerable to more serious contamination, particularly from unfamiliar pathogens or unusually high contamination levels falling well outside their typical range of tolerance. It's worth closing with one final practical clarification because it directly connects this broader biological discussion back to actual practical relevance for anyone watching. None of this evolutionary and physiological nuance changes the very real, practical advice that humans should continue avoiding untreated natural water sources whenever safer alternatives are available, since humans generally lack the kind of sustained local evolutionary exposure that provides wild animals with whatever partial protection they do actually possess. The interesting biological nuance explored throughout this topic doesn't suggest humans could or should follow the example of wildlife drinking directly from unfiltered natural sources. It simply provides a more accurate, more complete explanation for why wild animals appear to manage this specific risk somewhat differently, and in many specific cases, somewhat more successfully than an unprepared human typically would under the exact same circumstances. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full, accurate answer to why animals seem to tolerate dirty water so much better than humans turns out to involve a seriously interesting combination of factors, rather than any single, simple explanation on its own. Wild animals aren't actually immune to waterborne illness, and they absolutely do get sick and sometimes die from contaminated water, particularly particularly when that specific contamination involves pathogens or toxins falling outside their particular species' accumulated evolutionary exposure history. However, several real factors do combine to create the common, somewhat misleading impression that animals are simply immune to this kind of risk. Significant observation bias means documentary footage and casual wildlife viewing overwhelmingly show healthy animals rather than the less visible cases of illness and death from contaminated water exposure. Genuine evolutionary and physiological adaptation, including things like specialized, notably more acidic stomach environments in certain species, does provide meaningfully enhanced resilience to specific local pathogens for many wild animal populations. And modern human water treatment infrastructure has considerably reduced typical human exposure to natural waterborne pathogens, meaning humans frequently lack the kind of regular exposure and resulting immune adaptation that many wild animal populations have developed and maintained through consistent, ongoing exposure to their own specific local environment. So the next time you watch wildlife footage showing an animal calmly drinking from a distinctly murky-looking pond or stream, it's worth remembering that you're seeing a carefully, if unintentionally, curated selection of successful outcomes, not necessarily an accurate representation of how consistently safe or risk-free that specific water source, or contaminated water more generally, actually is for that particular animal or its entire broader population, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as seemingly obvious as animals can safely drink dirty water while humans can't turns out to reflect a meaningful combination of observation bias and genuine but limited physiological adaptation, rather than any simple absolute biological rule, what other confident, widely repeated assumptions about the natural world might be resting on a similarly incomplete picture, quietly shaped by which specific moments happen to get captured on camera, and which ones simply never make it into the footage most people actually get to see.